Across this day, we've had so many fantastic papers concerning the sort of 62 years of Vanbragh's life. It now falls to the four of us to deal with the 300 years that follow. And I think we're going to have a discussion about the sort of reception, the afterlife of Vanbrugh, how Vanbrugh is seen in various periods after his death. We might make that 300 years easier by skipping the first 50 or so, because, as some of you probably know, and I think is probably generally recognised to be the case, that whatever we might call the movement that Vanbrugh belongs to, along with Hawksmoor, Archer, and maybe Christopher Wren, the English Baroque, ends reasonably suddenly. The Palladian movement, if we want to call it that, is the dominant force in British architecture by the 1730s. And those years after Vanbrugh and then Hawksmoor's subsequent death are often seen as, you know, the sort of perhaps the bottom, the trough when it comes to the reception of Vanbrugh and his style. I'm going to hand over to Fran, though, because I think as we move towards the later 18th century, we begin to see a slight resurgence in an interest in Vanbrugh and his architecture. Is that right, Fran?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the neoclassicists started off reasonably tepid, and it sort of grew from there. The earliest moment that I have encountered, and some of you may have found others, and you can tell us afterwards if you have, the earliest moment of an architect actually saying something vaguely nice about Vanbrugh after he died was in 1758, when James Adam, the lesser-known brother of Robert Adam, was on a sort of a swan around England, if you like, with some of his Scottish friends, and they visited Blenheim, and he was heard to say he had seen few places where there was more movement. And that sounds like a very small thing, but given how important movement was to the Adam style, that actually is a rather large compliment coming from James Adam. But then it was another 15 years before Vanbrugh crops up again, to my knowledge. We're in the early 1770s, in the midst of the sort of intellectual war between Robert Adam and William Chambers, and they both have a go. William Chambers, in one of his early lectures at the Royal Academy, referred to Vanbrugh as having an air of grandeur and novelty that will always be admired by men of true judgment, and as it would happen, women of true judgment as well. So again, a reasonably brief mention, but this time really very openly warm. Robert Adam always, of course, has to disagree with William Chambers, so his admiration of Vanbrugh is, as I said, somewhat more tepid. This was alluded to earlier by Rory. When Robert Adam published his works in architecture in 1773, he wrote, or more likely there was a ghost writer in the form of his cousin, but he was involved in the writing of the introduction to the book. And I'm just going to read to you what was said about Vanbrugh there, because it is wonderfully polite and also wonderfully rude. So it goes, Vanbrugh understood better than either, Jones or Wren, the art of living among the great. A commodious arrangement of apartments was therefore his peculiar merit, but his lively imagination scorned the restraint of any rule of composition, and his passion for what was fancifully magnificent prevented him from discerning what was truly simple, elegant, or sublime. His work was unmatched in movement, novelty, or ingenuity, but his taste kept not pace with his genius. His buildings were crowned with barbarisms and absurdities, and so borne down by their own preposterous weight. I would suggest that his own words were rather borne down by preposterous weight, but there we are. Robert Adam wasn't known to be a very nice man. This is the beginning of starting to like Vanbrugh again and starting to appreciate his brilliance. But it really wasn't until Joshua Reynolds, a decade later in 1786, when he was giving his 13th discourse at the Royal Academy, that people really started to take notice. Reynolds only mentions Vanbrugh very briefly, but it's testament to the fact that when Reynolds spoke, people sat up and took notice. He was, of course, the first president of the Royal Academy, and his word was gold. And he wrote in that 13th discourse that Vanbrugh, who was a poet as well as an architect, he writes, "There is a greater display of imagination than we shall find perhaps in any other." So an extremely brief mention, but it is got absolute clarity, and it started this wave of everyone believing that actually Vanbrugh was something of a genius. And by the time we get to a generation later, and Sir John Soane is lecturing at the Royal Academy, he was appointed Professor of Architecture there in 1806, you really start to see this sort of universal adoration. Soane utilised his Royal Academy lectures really as a vehicle to be terribly rude about everyone and everything. But he was nothing but complimentary about Vanbrugh, and he mentioned him about a dozen times. I do actually, I don't know if it's scrolling through, but he produced around 1,100 of these large-scale illustrative lecture drawings of buildings from throughout time and throughout the world, showing good and bad examples of architecture. And he did a whole series of beautiful Vanbrugh buildings. And I just want to read you the principal thing that Vanbrugh wrote about, that Soane wrote about Vanbrugh in his 5th lecture. And it really is, you know, extremely complimentary. He writes, "It is impossible to contemplate the work of Sir John Vanbrugh without feeling those emotions which the happy effort of genius alone can produce. In his bold flights of irregular fancy, his powerful mind rises superior to common conceptions and entitles him to the high distinctive appellation of the Shakespeare of architects. To try the works of such an artist by the strict rules of Palladian tameness would be like judging the works and mighty darings of the immortal bard by the frigid rules of Aristotle. Vanbrugh for invention has no equal in this country. Boldness of fancy, unlimited variety, and discrimination of character mark all his productions. He had all the fire and power of Michelangelo and Bernini without any of the elegant softness and classical delicacy of Palladio and his followers." And Soane wasn't very complimentary about the Neo-Palladians, so that is a sort of backhanded compliment as well. So by the time you get to Soane, really everything is rosy. And people like Cockerell are sort of following suit, and he writes words about Vanbrugh to the effect of, you know, vast effect, movement, good effect of long passages, that sort of thing. So there on out, everybody is happy, and Vanbrugh wins the day.
Or does he? Because, Jeremy, could you pick up the story in the 19th century when I think one say, well, I mean, you know, again, thinking about the reception of Vanbrugh and his period, we get another potential, a period of decline in interest again, would you say?
Yes, I think the mid-19th century, the Gothic revival and the sort of distaste amongst a gang of leading figures in architecture about imported styles, and the sense that, you know, there's often descriptions about Vanbragh's buildings being too heavy. So, I mean, I completely agree. Incidentally, I think Franz set it up beautifully, but there was a sort of debate that followed. But then I think he comes crawling back in this splendid sporting way that he has when we're really looking for national heroes. About, you know, it's a sense of British identity. Who are the great figures? And you look around, and even if you don't like those houses, they are the great houses of history and the great houses of British history to be admired and savoured. And I think that's where he sort of re-enters the pantheon. And also, it then sort of merges with the sort of Edwardian kind of baroque for the public building when he becomes one of those figures like Wren and Hawksmoor and others. You know, they all become the sort of reference points for the great sort of resurgence of an English baroque for the public world. But it also intrigued me thinking about that of course, and I think it's been hinted at in other papers today, excellent papers today, that of course country houses were great public buildings. You know, they were built with national identity in mind, and of course, and they were seats of local government in many ways. And of course, no house more expresses that than, I think, Blenheim, which was built in the, you know, from the public, partly from the public purse as well. So it sees itself, you know, an expression of this. So it's not surprising that it re-enters the dialogue. Taking it on into the early 20th century, and I think it still belongs to that searching for national heroes. So I became very interested in the country life photographs that were taken, some of which I hope are accompanying us above. And I realised that the great majority of them, and many of which I published in a book quite a long time ago, were done in the 20s. So they were done around the time of the bicentenary of his death. 100 years ago, and it was sort of almost picked up, and I'm not quite sure whether they were rebuffing Goodhart Rendell or not, but Christopher Hussey and his older boss, Avery Tipping, really go for the great Vanbrugh projects, and indeed they produce a book in the series called In English Homes, which had begun 20 years before. And this is the book which is described as the how in the English homes in the age of Sir John Vanbrugh and his school. It's not a title I think anyone would use now, but it showed how important they felt he was at that time. And the photography was extensive. So I just picked up a note recently thinking about this, that 140, a little bit like the slides of Soane's lectures, presentation images rather, 140 pictures of Castle Howard alone, taken in the 20s by Country Life magazine, many of which appeared in articles and then the book. And there's a splendid description of how unpopular the photographer, who was called Henson, made himself, because he insisted on having the guano swept out of the Castle Howard mausoleum by the servants of the house, who were sort of driven out to sort of, and then that was not enough. They had to stay sloshing water to keep it reflecting nicely for the photography. So that went down in legend, really. But that's really why there was this fantastic group of photographs. It was driven by their desire to cover the great buildings of English architecture, but the country houses, that is the Country Life lens. The only thing I really wanted to add, a little bit like Fran, was some quotes, because I remember we all are indebted, of course, to Kerry Downes, his great biography, and other monographs, and there are many other more recent scholars. But I was quite intrigued, as sitting in my garden office at home, that I looked up and I thought, well, I wonder what the titans of architectural history in the middle of the century, of the last century, the 20th century, were writing about Vanbrugh. So I looked up Outline of European Architecture and Pevsner, and I'm just going to pull one quote. And he principally compares Vanbrugh to Wren. Wren never seems to forget himself. He is never carried away by forces stronger than his reason. Vanbrugh designs are of a violence and ruthless directness that could not but offend the rationalists of his age. Quite a statement, isn't it? So Summerson, what did Summerson say? Summerson devotes 2 pages in Architecture in Britain. So the first edition of Outline of European Architecture is 1940s. Of course, it goes into dozens of revisions. It's really amazing how influential these books, in a sense, must have been to be that regularly updated. Architecture in Britain, 1530 to 1830, 1953, first edition, revised and revised after that. He spends 2 pages discussing, guess what? The relationship of Vanbrugh and Hawksmoor in order to understand this period of English architecture. But he sees it very much in sort of architecture form. And he describes what they achieved. So he puts them together. And he says that there's a change in sort of attitude to architecture. Quotes, a renewed interest in the intrinsic quality of mass, rhythm, and proportion, as opposed to the extrinsic management of form by the apparatus of classical design. There's quite a lot in that sentence alone. I flicked over to David Watkin, always the master of the sort of summing up, has one sentence that caught my eye. English Baroque came of age overnight with Castle Howard, full stop. Says more, of course. So then I glanced over and there's an old Thames and Hudson book, 1964, Baroque and Rococo by Germain Bazin. I don't know if anyone remembers this book. And I thought, I wonder what he says. I wonder what a French person says about Vanbrugh and Hawksmoor. And he talks about Castle Howard and Blenheim. Very, very little is talked about the English stuff. In each of them, the aim of the whole conception was to create an overriding impression of magnificence and to surprise the onlooker with richness of effects and the imposing distribution of the masses. Yet in spite of everything, one feels that this architectural language is opposed to the English temperament. There is a lack of that imagination and that imaginative impetus which creates the poetic quality of the Baroque, where this style is spontaneous in other European countries. That's all I got to say.
Gosh, wow. Okay. Thank you, Jeremy. We'll come back to some of this in a minute. Oh, in your brilliant book on Hawksmoor, you so wonderfully explore Hawksmoor's reception in the post-war period. You've got about 5 minutes to do the same with Vanbrugh. Go.
Thank you. Well, I mean, I think as we've heard from Fran and Jeremy, Vanbrugh doesn't disappear in the way that Hawksmoor really did for much of the 19th century. And we've heard a few mentions of the Goodhart Rendell book in the 1920s, which is a very peculiar book in a whole number of different ways. And Goodhart Rendell, I think, was quite a peculiar character. But that wasn't necessary for Vanbrugh because he was there. And I think, that's simply, in many ways, the fact that you can't really ignore the scale of what he did. Blenheim Palace is bloody massive. It's very prominent. And, Hawksmoor, in contrast, had these strange churches in East London. So I guess doing that Hawksmoor book, I was interested in, the depths and then the ascent, and Vanbrugh is a little bit more even. But there is certainly this sense, particularly in the 20s, as Jeremy alluded to, that there's, Wren, Hawksmoor, Vanbrugh are in a kind of competition. And, Hawksmoor goes up, so Wren goes down. And, he was sort of used, I think, as a little bit of a stick to beat the sort of Wren enthusiasts. And I think in that last comment, and I think particularly actually the Summerson analysis as well, seen as a sort of almost as a fundamentally different architect to Wren, not rational, more emotional, looking almost at architecture as a sculptural object. And I think Vanbrugh was part and parcel of that. But I'm kind of personally always interested in moments of sort of transition in architectural cultures and architectural ideas, which is partly why I'm interested in the Baroque, is partly why I'm interested in postmodernism. And again, looking at the way that Vanbrugh and Hawksmoor come together and come apart, they're part of that sort of search for alternatives, architectural alternatives to the modern movement, really beginning in the 1950s and 1960s. Both feature very prominently in Robert Venturi's Complexity and Contradiction, which is described as the gentle manifesto, and I suppose it was, in contrast to sort of the Corbusian, tough, hard manifesto of modernism. And it's almost a kind of rewriting of architectural history for the purposes of the present, looking at a number of different architects who explore these ideas of complexity and contradiction in architecture that Venturi felt had been ignored by the preeminence of the modern movement over the sort of preceding almost half century by that point. And he talks about a number of different buildings, talks about the ambiguity of Grimsthorpe, of the pavilions, whether they're both big and small, near and far. He likes the fact that you can't necessarily read them as one or the other. He talks about double functioning elements, the way that columns are both structural devices, but also act symbolically, in the way Vanbrugh really kind of takes that to quite extremes. He mentions the sort of kitchen court gateway at Blenheim, for example. There are a number of different examples, but I think what I've found quite interesting is it sort of situates Vanbrugh within this sort of, what is sort of on the one hand a sort of counter canon, in a sense, if that's not a contradiction in terms, but full of actually familiar canonical figures. So Michelangelo and Palladio, and Borromini and Bernini, even Le Corbusier is co-opted into this. But it's a way of rethinking how we see these architects and how we see what they created. And I don't know how many of those 5 minutes I have left, but if I have one more minute,
Please.
That again, one of the other reasons why I'm interested in that moment is there's lots of kind of, in the way like the early modern movement in the 1950s and 1960s, there are it's not just the emergence of postmodernism. In the 1950s, it's the emergence of new brutalism, which in a funny way they have a number of affinities to each other. Addison, Peter Smithson, sort of preeminent figures of that movement, along with Ray and Banham. And they were also interested in Vanbrugh. They studied in Newcastle. They, I think, clearly visited Seton Delaval Hall at the time, possibly were even sent to do measured drawings of it. So they were kind of very much aware of Vanbrugh, and in their sort of theorization. I mean, they're very odd figures in a number of ways, and their writing is kind of almost the strangest part of their production. Their buildings are almost straightforward in comparison, but they talk about single field and multiple field spaces, and they advocate multiple field spaces as these kind of layered, clustered, interconnected spaces, in contrast to the single field, which is centralized and rigid and hierarchical, which is a kind of typical classical space, but also the typical kind of almost kind of Corbusian modernist space. But they like these multi-field spaces, and they see many examples in Vanbrugh's work. And there's some kind of really weird writing about the way they see Blenheim, but Castle Howard particularly, but also Seton Delaval Hall as these kind of they're interested in the space in between, that's created by what they call the legs in the air, which is essentially the sort of pinnacles and things on the pavilions, the turrets and things like that. And they associate that with their own ideas for creating an urbanism out of architecture, which I guess is figured most strongly in something like the Economist building in St James's. And it's a kind of cluster of different buildings of different heights, and actually what's as important as the buildings themselves is the space in between that's created. But you can't trust anything they say, because they spent the whole 1970s, when they had no work, writing and revisiting their earlier works and actually situating them more in almost a sort of picturesque tradition, which they had worked very hard to try to reject in the 1950s. And brutalism was anti-picturesque, and then they sort of moved back to it. So and I suppose almost become closer to Vanbrugh. And to what degree that is a response or reaction to postmodernism, which they were committed modernists, is an interesting question.
All of their theories seem to end with the words "in the air." Anyway, fantastic. Thank you, you three. We've little bit time left before drinks, and I wonder whether we might sort of end by thinking about where we are with Vanbrugh. Owen, you mentioned the sort of and Jeremy as well, that Vanbrugh's sort of reception is a slightly more stable one than Hawksmoor, but he and Hawksmoor and Wren seem to sort of go up and down in various periods. I've been thinking a lot today about 3 years ago, and some of you were here in this room when we were talking about the tercentenary of Wren's death. And I've been noticing this year, perhaps slightly sort of grumbling about it, because I sort of principally identify myself as a Wren scholar, that I think this tercentenary has actually received considerably more attention than Wren's 3 years ago. That may be down to your book, Charles, I don't know. But
No, it's thanks to the Wren tercentenary.
We got the ball rolling.
Well, because I felt that Wren was slightly underplayed.
Okay.
And it made me think that actually start earlier.
Okay.
So that we had
I was there.
It was the only time I got
Yeah.
So
I remember.
I missed the meeting I had organised to talk about the Vanbrugh tercentenary at the Paul Mellon Centre, which was 3 years ago.
But I don't know, I just, yeah.
And then the Georgian group went away, and then they put in the application. That's what's made it a big thing.
Mm-hmm.
Because my view is that up until that moment, at the moment the Heritage Lottery Fund gave us, suddenly all those people who had said to me, I discovered we're doing great, wonderful exhibitions.
Well, perhaps you proved what I'm about to say wrong, and it's actually all about money. But my sense,
No, it's about timing.
but I also think that back to something you said, Owen, that there's a sort of that there's an emotional, that people seem that in periods where we're looking for emotion, Vanbrugh might be higher than Wren, and Wren might be the sort of perhaps a slightly harder figure to sometimes understand. And I wonder today, in the 21st century, whether we might find Vanbrugh a slightly more appealing figure and an architect that we feel happier celebrating than Wren, just because he might be a little bit more accessible. I don't know whether the panel think that.
I could tell you a little anecdote that I did in about 2007 or 8. Frank will know. I was rather thrilled to be asked by David Watkin to do a lecture on Vanbrugh for his undergraduate course, Jones to Soane. It's a very famous course in the art history department. I think it must have been its last year or so. Was that right? And I was rather nervous.
I'm not bringing it back.
I was well, time will tell. But I was rather nervous, and I remember another tutor said, "Oh no, don't worry, the students love Vanbrugh." So just says something, doesn't it? But I think Wren is a great figure, but he's quite an establishment figure. Whereas Vanbrugh, despite the fact that he's part of the Whig sort of meritocracy or whatever, he feels a bit wild and on the edge of things.
But this is, as Fran was saying, by the late 18th century, as soon as someone's sort of properly theorised the sublime, of course they're going to get back to him and have fun. And he
yes,
I wonder whether
perfect timing.
We have these extraordinary drawings. We're about to see all three of the Blenheim drawings together in the next slide, I think, where you see Blenheim in Soane's Royal Academy lecture drawings in full light, dim light, no, full light, half light and dim light, as if it's sort of full day, twilight and nighttime. And it's all about the sort of the romance of the massing of the building. If you strip away the ornamental detail, all the fussiness that Vanbrugh is so sort of talked about for, and actually just think about the massing of the building, all that sort of, what was it, legs in the air? Brilliant.
Yeah, legs in the air.
Legs in the air?
Yeah.
That's
Which you can see so beautifully here. It's really quite powerful, and we have noticed that people really take to these three drawings, perhaps more than any of the others. We actually did a fundraising do for Charles and Roz's exhibition that's on at the Soane at the moment, where I got some of these drawings out, and people just went completely doolally over these Blenheim drawings. It was really rather wonderful. So yeah, it's extraordinary, the impact that Vanbrugh has, emotively speaking.
Yeah, and I think these drawings are amazing. I think it's what happens when you strip out the ornaments. You're left with the kind of the raw forms. Somehow it takes it out of being this historical thing, or gives it less of the sort of historical specificity, and you can begin to connect to it on a kind of more elemental or emotional way. And I think that was why I think Hawksmoor was sort of rediscovered by architects in particular, was actually what he created almost sort of transcended, because it was so plain, it was so austere, it transcended a particular time. It wasn't easy to pin down as early 18th century Baroque. Vanbrugh, because it's more ornate, I think it sits within that historical period more, and also I think because of the typologies as well, perhaps. Country houses carry a lot of baggage.
Yeah.
I mean, churches do as
Unlike
well.
churches.
But no, of course. But it's in a very different way.
When we do Hawksmoor's tercentenary in the next decade, all the contemporary architects will turn up, which they haven't for Wren and Vanbrugh. Do you think?
Maybe. I mean, I think the Hawksmoor peaked. I think probably in the 1980s.
I think.
Yeah. I mean, it's an interesting question. I mean, I think the way we look at all of these architects is in many ways a reflection of the present and our present concerns and interests and the broader context. So what it says about us now that we're interested in Vanbrugh, it's had such a resonance. I mean, I think also, Charles, you've got a very good publicist working on the Vanbrugh's 300 project, so that does help. But I think you're right. It's cut through that in a way that perhaps goes beyond the organisation and planning, however important
I think
that actually is, and why that is. I think is an interesting question.
But it's interesting to find this panel, I think, Matthew. The parallel rather, but with the 1920s photography and publications around sort of re-identifying and new scholarship. I mean, they were quite scholarly in their approach. And it's marvellous in this conference today to realise that there's so much interesting work going on that really is actually, pushing the boundaries of our understanding. Because if you were working sort of just after all the publications of the big Kerry Downes biography, etc., it must have seemed a much harder field to enter.
Yeah.
And now I think there's enough distance between that and enough discovery of new things and new perspectives. There are a lot of things that we haven't talked about today. Obviously, we were talking about it earlier, the sort of military architecture tradition, which is extremely interesting and complex. I think it's just about being touched on, but his letter to the Duchess of Marlborough about preserving the manor at Woodstock, I think is one of the most astonishing letters from that period that I know. And I read it in a lecture every year to students because it's about how did people think in that time and how did they express ideas. And he is one of the great people for sort of articulating notions.
Yeah. On that positive note, I think we will end it there. Can we thank our three speakers in this final session?